They found handprints and drawings that are between 35,000 and 40,000 years old. At a minimum, they could be even older.
For 40,000 years, something inside Vanguard Cave was hidden behind a wall of packed sand. Not collapsed rock, not natural debris, a deliberate seal. When archaeologists finally broke through after 9 years of excavation, they entered a chamber untouched since the last Neanderthals were alive. And what waited inside looked less like an ancient shelter and more like the aftermath of something terrifying. Deep claw marks ripped through solid limestone from the inside, bones of predators that should never have shared the same space. A seashell carried into total darkness and placed at the very back of the cave. Someone sealed this chamber shut, and something inside tried desperately to escape. The seal, what 9 years of digging led to. For 9 years, a team of archaeologists worked through the deepest section of Vanguard Cave in Gibraltar. Led by Professor Clive Finlayson, one of the world's foremost authorities on Neanderthal behavior, the team removed sediment one careful layer at a time. Every bucket was screened. Every fragment was examined. Progress was measured in centimeters. 9 years of dust and darkness and silence before anything unusual appeared. Then they hit something that stopped the entire excavation cold. It was not rock. It was not collapsed debris. It was sand. Dense, compacted ancient sand sitting inside the cave passage with no geological reason to be there. Sand does not form that way on its own inside an enclosed chamber. It does not compact itself into a sealed wall without external force. When scientists examined it, they confirmed what the team had already begun to fear. That sand had not shifted in at least 40,000 years. It had been placed there deliberately, packed tightly into the passage, sealing whatever was behind it away from the world. Removing it took enormous care. And when it was finally cleared, what it had been hiding for 40,000 years was a chamber carved into the very roof of the cave. 13 meters deep, roughly 42 feet of enclosed, undisturbed darkness, completely cut off from the outside world since before modern humans painted the first cave walls in France and Spain, since before farming, since before any civilization on Earth had taken its first breath. The moment the passage opened, the air that came through was unlike anything the team had experienced. Cold, stale, carrying a faint organic smell that comes only from biological material preserved in absolute stillness for an incomprehensible amount of time. The dust that rose had not been disturbed since the last Neanderthal walked this coastline. Archaeologists describe the sensation of entering as stepping into a pressurized silence. No airflow, no sound. A room that had been completely still while the entire world outside it changed beyond recognition. This chamber was not a shelter. There is no survival reason to go 13 meters deep into a sealed rock ceiling. It was not a passage to anywhere. It ended. And here is the detail that changes how you understand everything that follows. Vanguard Cave sits on a cliffside carved by ancient wave action. When this chamber was sealed, sea levels were far lower than they are today. Whoever sealed it could stand at the cave mouth and look directly out at the open ocean. They could see their world clearly. And they still chose to go deep into this rock, pack sand into the entrance behind them and close it. Something was placed inside that chamber, and then it was shut away from the world. The team was about to find out what. Bones, claws, and things that should not be there. The first thing the archaeologists saw when they stepped inside was not bones. It was not objects. It was the walls. Every surface of that sealed chamber was covered in deep gouge marks cut directly into the limestone. These were not surface scratches. These were not marks left by tools or time. These were long, deep channels driven into solid rock with sustained and desperate force, running in tight, repeated lines as if whatever made them had gone over the same spot again and again, trying to get through. The stone itself had been torn into. The effort required to leave marks that deep in solid limestone is enormous, and every single one of those marks had been made from the inside. Whatever made them was not trying to get in. It was sealed in, and it spent its final hours trying to claw its way out through solid rock. Then the team found the bones. Lynx, spotted hyena, griffin vulture, 3 completely different apex predators, their remains gathered together in a sealed, elevated chamber deep inside a cliff. These animals do not share space in nature. They compete violently for it. Lynx and spotted hyenas are direct rivals. They do not den together. Griffin vultures are large birds that actively avoid enclosed spaces. No natural process on Earth deposits all 3 of these species together inside a sealed room. Researchers at the site were direct about what the evidence points toward. These animals were brought here, selected and carried into this chamber by Neanderthals, most likely for hunting practice, ritual use, or as part of a deliberate process of harvesting specific animal parts, bones, feathers, and pelts that held value beyond food. Professor Finlayson's team noted that Neanderthals at this site showed repeated evidence of collecting materials from animals that were not purely food sources. The birds in particular pointed toward this. Griffin vultures are not eaten. Their feathers are large, distinctive, and difficult to obtain. Something about these specific animals made them worth bringing deep into a sealed space inside a cliff. The hyena remains complicated further. Spotted hyenas are bone-crushing scavengers with some of the most powerful jaws of any land animal. They are not prey that a human drags into a cave easily. Bringing one here required effort, risk, and intention. Their bones show no signs of having denned or died naturally in the chamber. They were placed there. And then there are the claw marks on the walls again, made from the inside, by something with no way out. Whatever was put in that sealed chamber and left there drove its claws into solid limestone until it could not claw anymore. That is what the physical evidence preserves. The final hours of something trapped in total darkness 40,000 years ago still cut into the stone. The team stood in that chamber surrounded by the bones of animals that should not have been there, and the claw marks of something that had tried desperately to escape. And then one of them found something small, sitting quietly at the very back of the room. Something that had no business being there at all. The whelk, one shell that broke a century of assumptions. It was sitting at the deepest point of the chamber, as far from the entrance as it was possible to go. A large whelk shell, a type of sea snail that lives in shallow coastal water. It does not travel, it does not climb, it does not end up inside sealed rock chambers through any natural process. Someone carried it there. Someone walked down to the Mediterranean shoreline, picked up this creature, carried it inland, entered the cave, went 13 meters deep into sealed darkness, and placed it at the furthest possible point from the entrance. That is not accidental. That is a deliberate act carried out by a being with a specific reason for doing it. Professor Finlayson stated it plainly. Somebody took that whelk in there over 40,000 years ago. And because of the age of the chamber, those people can only have been Neanderthals. Food is stored near exits. It is cached somewhere accessible and easy to retrieve. A shell placed at the absolute furthest point from the entrance of a sealed 13-meter chamber does not fit any food storage logic. But here is what does fit. At Neanderthal sites across Europe, whelk shells of this exact species have been found with traces of ochre inside the shell cup. Ochre is a red mineral pigment. Neanderthals used it to color their skin, their tools, and surfaces around them. The curved, hollow interior of a whelk shell is the right shape to hold pigment, mix it, and apply it. It functions perfectly as a paint container. This means the shell carried into that sealed chamber was most likely not a meal. It was a creative tool, a container for color. Proof that Neanderthals were decorating themselves and their world with deliberate artistic intention. That single detail dismantles one of the longest-standing assumptions in science. Creativity, the ability to take raw materials and transform them into something expressive and symbolic, was considered an exclusively modern human trait. It was the explanation used for why we survived and they did not. The argument was simple. We created, they did not. A whelk shell carried 20 meters inland into total darkness, used as a vessel for pigment by a being that has been extinct for 40,000 years, destroys that argument completely. They were not just surviving, they were creating. They were decorating. They were making deliberate choices about color and expression and meaning in a world that science said they were too dim to comprehend. For most of the 20th century, the scientific portrait of Neanderthals was humiliating. Dim, slow, hunched, incapable of complex thought. The story told in textbooks was clean and simple. Modern humans arrived from Africa around 40,000 years ago, and the intellectually inferior Neanderthals faded away. That story was repeated for generations as fact. These were not desperate, stumbling creatures collapsing toward extinction. They were thinking, creating, deciding what mattered enough to carry into the dark. And the deeper layers beneath that chamber were holding something that made even that look small. The hearth, chemistry built by a species we called primitive. Buried in the older sediment layers beneath the sealed chamber, researchers uncovered something that should not have existed. Not according to everything science had previously said about what Neanderthals were capable of. It was a hearth, but not a fire pit. Not a place where someone lit wood and cooked meat. This was a purpose-built structure, a circular pit with two separate internal channels and thick reinforced walls, constructed specifically to heat plant material in conditions with almost no oxygen present. Scientists dated it to 60,000 years ago. The process this hearth was designed to carry out is called pyrolysis. Here is how it works. When plant material is heated at high temperatures with very little oxygen allowed in, the resin locked inside the plant breaks down and seeps out as a thick, extremely sticky liquid. Once it cools, that liquid becomes tar. Hard, durable, powerfully adhesive tar. Neanderthals in Gibraltar were building engineered structures to produce this tar on purpose, with controlled heat, with controlled airflow, in a cave on the Mediterranean coast. 60,000 years before modern science gave this process a name. The two-channel design is the part that matters most. A single channel is the obvious starting point, the simplest possible version of this idea. The hearth found here has two channels with insulated walls and carefully considered internal geometry. That level of refinement does not come from a first attempt. It comes from someone who built a simpler version, watched it fail, worked out why it failed, and rebuilt it better. That is not instinct. That is accumulated knowledge passed down deliberately from one generation to the next. Someone taught this, someone learned it, someone improved it. And that process repeated across hundreds of years. They did not use birch bark like Neanderthals in colder regions. They adapted the process to gum rock rose, a shrub native to the Mediterranean coast. Adapting a chemical process to entirely new raw materials requires understanding the principle behind it, not just memorizing the steps. They knew what they were doing well enough to make it work somewhere new. Chemical analysis of the tar produced at this site showed something that stops the argument completely. The quality was consistent across multiple separate production events. This was not experimental. It was repeatable, standardized output. They were producing the same result reliably across time. That is quality control, built into a 60,000-year-old hearth by a species that science called incapable of complex reasoning. The tar was used to bind stone points onto wooden shafts, composite weapons with two manufactured components designed to function as a system. If the tar failed or the point broke, the weapon stopped working. Neanderthals understood that dependency and managed it. They maintained their tools, identified failures, and replaced components. That is forward planning. That is systems thinking, from a species we spent a century dismissing. The engraving, 54 strokes. Deeper inside Gorham's Cave, cut into the limestone bedrock, researchers found a pattern. A cross-hatching design, lines crossing lines in a structured repeating form, pressed into solid rock by a pointed stone tool. Researchers confirmed it was older than 39,000 years. Modern humans had not yet reached this part of Europe when it was made. They counted the strokes required to produce it. At minimum, 54 separate passes of the tool through the same grooves. Not one continuous motion, not an accidental byproduct of tool use. Each stroke was an individual decision. Whoever made this engraving stopped between strokes, assessed what they had produced, and chose to continue. They did that 54 times. Experimental replication revealed something that removes all remaining doubt about what this was. Researchers were able to reconstruct the exact sequence in which the lines were made. The primary lines came first. The secondary infill strokes came after, filling the spaces between the first lines with precision. That sequence means the maker had a complete image in mind before the first stroke touched the rock. They were not discovering the design as they went. They had already decided what it would look like, then they made it. Now consider where inside the cave this was found, not near the entrance where daylight reaches, not in a naturally lit area. The engraving was made in a section of the cave where natural light does not reach. Whoever carved those 54 deliberate strokes worked in near total darkness. Either they knew the design so completely they could execute it by touch and memory alone, or they produced artificial light to work by. There is no third option. Both require a level of intentional planning that the old model of Neanderthal cognition cannot accommodate. For decades, the ability to produce abstract markings, patterns that carry meaning beyond their physical form, was considered the defining line between our species and every other that ever lived. It was the explanation for every cognitive advantage modern humans supposedly held. The argument went that Neanderthals could not cross that line. That symbolic thought was ours alone. The Gorham's Cave engraving was already here before modern humans arrived in this region. It was made by a Neanderthal, in the dark, with a planned design, using 54 deliberate strokes. Professor Finlayson, the researcher who led this work and has spent his career studying these caves, was asked directly what the engraving means. His answer was this: is it art? Is it a doodle? I don't know, but it is clearly an abstract design, made more than 39,000 years ago at a time when there were no modern humans anywhere near Gibraltar. The world's leading authority on Neanderthal behavior looked at this engraving and said he does not know what it is. Not because the evidence is unclear, because the evidence is clearer than the existing framework can handle. The burials. The cave gave us a sealed chamber, engineered weapons, and symbols carved in the dark. But there is evidence from Neanderthal sites across Europe that goes further than any of that. Evidence that forces a conclusion that is harder to sit with than anything a hearth or an engraving can produce. They buried their dead, not abandoned them, not left them where they fell, buried them with deliberate care, in ways that suggest the people doing the burying believed deeply that it mattered. At Vanguard Cave in northern Iraq, a Neanderthal was buried approximately 60,000 years ago. When researchers analyzed the soil around the body, they found concentrated deposits of pollen from multiple species of flowering plants: ephedra, groundsel, grape hyacinth, plants that do not grow inside caves, plants that had to be collected from the outside world and carried in and placed around this body by someone who made that choice. These are the oldest known grave offerings ever discovered on Earth. They belong to a Neanderthal burial. The position of the body is the detail that does not leave you. It was not simply placed on the ground. It was arranged. Knees drawn up toward the chest, arms folded carefully across the body, placed in a shallow pit that shows clear signs of having been deliberately dug into the cave floor. Someone decided how this person would spend the rest of time. They dug the ground to receive them. They arranged every limb with care, and then they covered them over and left. At La Ferracie in France, multiple Neanderthals were found buried together, adults and children, separate graves within the same site, arranged in a way that reflects the relationships between the people buried there. A family group, organized in death the way they likely lived together. Whoever buried them understood that these individuals belonged to each other and made sure they would not be separated. At several sites, red ochre, the same mineral pigment Neanderthals used on their bodies and tools, was found applied directly to the bones of the buried dead. They marked their dead with color, for reasons that cannot be explained by survival or practical need. The act of coloring a body that can no longer move or feel serves no functional purpose. It serves only meaning. It means the dead still mattered after death. At some burial sites, the bones of large animals, aurochs and deer, were found deliberately placed alongside the human remains, not food scraps left nearby. Arranged, positioned beside the dead as if given to them for a journey, as if whoever buried them believed there was somewhere to go after this world ended. A species that science described as primitive was carrying flowers to its dead, was folding their bodies with intention, was marking them with pigment, was placing offerings beside them for something beyond this life. Whatever they believed waited on the other side of death, they believed it completely enough to act on it. And believing in something that cannot be seen or touched or proven requires a mind that can imagine a world it has never been to. These were not animals disposing of waste. They were people saying goodbye. The disappearance. The answer nobody wants to say out loud. Everything points to the same question. If Neanderthals engineered weapons, produced chemistry, carved symbols in the dark, and buried their dead with grief and ritual, then what actually ended them? And why does the honest answer make so many researchers go quiet? Traditional science placed Neanderthal extinction at around 40,000 years ago. The evidence at Gibraltar pushes that date forward. Artifacts at this site suggest some Neanderthals survived here until as recently as 32,000 years ago. Possibly the last group of their kind anywhere on Earth, on a narrow strip of coastline at the southern edge of Europe, with the sea rising in front of them and something pressing in from behind. That something was us. Across Europe, the disappearance of Neanderthal artifacts from the archaeological record lines up with the arrival of modern humans. Not approximately, region by region precisely. Every time modern humans reached a new part of Europe, the Neanderthal presence in that region ended. This pattern repeats so consistently across the entire continent that explaining it as coincidence requires evidence that has never materialized. Modern humans today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, confirmed, inherited, passed down through every generation since the two species made contact. That contact happened multiple times across different regions, which means there were moments when Neanderthals and modern humans were not just sharing a continent. They were close enough to have children together, and one of those species still ceased to exist. Some Neanderthal remains from this final period carry evidence of skeletal trauma, blunt force injuries, sharp force damage on bones, not from animal attacks, from weapons. The same category of weapons Neanderthals themselves had spent tens of thousands of years refining. Someone used them against Neanderthals. In their final years on Earth, the land was disappearing too. The vast coastal shelf that once stretched more than 4 kilometers beyond the cave mouth, the open hunting ground of dunes and woodland and wildlife that had sustained Neanderthal life in Gibraltar for generations, was sinking beneath rising seas. The shoreline compressed. The hunting ground shrank. Generation by generation, the water advanced, and the land they had built their entire existence around was swallowed. They had nowhere left to go. 2 catastrophes arrived at the same time. One geological, one human. And the species that made tar, buried its dead with flowers, and carved planned designs into rock by artificial light, was compressed into the last habitable strip of ground at the edge of a continent until there was nothing left. Between 1 and 4% of every non-African person alive today is Neanderthal. They did not vanish completely. They dissolved into us. What ended was not their biology entirely. What ended was everything else. Their knowledge, their burials, their grief, their engravings, everything they had learned and believed and passed down across hundreds of thousands of years, gone in what amounts to an instant in geological time. The sealed chambers sat in total darkness for 40,000 years while the world above it was transformed completely. When it was finally opened, what was inside was not treasure. It was a record, left by people who had no idea they were the last. The excavation continues. The sediment layers beneath the chamber floor have not yet been reached, and Professor Finlayson has said it plainly. As the digging goes deeper, what they find is only going to get bigger. Every layer still buried down there is another chapter of a story that was almost lost forever. The people who sealed that chamber and carried that shell and placed flowers on their dead were not a lesser version of us. They were a different version. And whatever took them from this earth, they did not deserve it.